Hi, Julia Usher. Welcome back to my kitchen. This is Recipes for a Sweet Life. If you don't know the name of my channel, please tune in, and I'd appreciate it if you subscribe if you like this video. Today I'm going to take the basic tuile, the triangular tuile cone that I made in my Tuile 101 video last week, up a notch by turning it into this really cool all cookie ice cream cone. Yes, this is all cookie. The bottom is a tuile, which is a very thin cookie that gets shaped hot out of the oven. And the top, the soft swirl part, is actually a hard meringue, which I covered in yet another video. So the twist you're going to see in this video are how to create that waffle cone effect, and then how to put it all together, how to make the soft swirl, and how to put it all together into this nice little dessert. It's got a surprise mousse filling. So to get started, this is what you'll need. You'll need these cones, and I'm going to refer you back to my Tuile 101 video for the basics of mixing the batter, but I'm going to show you exactly how I shaped it and created that waffle cone effect. For each cone, you'll also need 2 soft swirl meringues, one that without little nonpareils and sugar confetti on top, and one with, because they're going to get sandwiched together and nestled into the top to create a really big ice cream cone. And I've got them in various colors. So to make this cone, I have a whole other video that talks about how to mix the batter. I'm going to show you how to spread it and apply the texture to it today. To spread it, you will need a triangular acetate stencil. And again, in the Tuile 101 video, I show how to cut this, but we will be working with that today. You'll need a cone-shaped cream horn mold to shape it into a cone. And you'll need a grid type thing. This is actually something that I got at the paint store. It's a plastic grid. I think it was used for hardware purposes, but I sanitized it. I'm going to use it to stencil through. It's got a really nice diamond pattern. But basically, you're looking for anything through which you could sift cocoa powder and powdered sugar to create a pattern. It looks kind of diamond-like. Now for the meringue, you'll need the following. It's a hard meringue, and I've got the recipe in Ultimate Cookies, and I have a whole other video that talks about the hard meringue process. We are going to mix it though on set, because once you mix it, you have to use it immediately. You can't set it aside and come back to it later. It's really best used right away. So I'll show you how that is. It starts with 4 large egg whites, a cup of superfine sugar. For a hard meringue, you need about 4 tablespoons of superfine sugar to every large egg white so that the meringue sets up crisp and crunchy all the way through. If you use a different ratio of sugar to white, you might end up with a different type of meringue that is actually crunchy on the outside but soft on the inside. To stabilize the meringue, we're adding a little bit of cream of tartar and some additional cornstarch, and all those ratios will be listed in the video description and also in my book if you happen to have that. A couple of other little doodads you'll need. Some food coloring. I use my same liquid gel food coloring that I color icings with. I'm going to use that to tint the meringue and also to tint the waffle cone batter. And then some little fun sugar confetti and jimmies to sprinkle on top of the meringue so they really truly look like ice cream cones. Before we start mixing the meringue, I want to make sure that the pan is ready because, as I mentioned earlier, this is best piped when it's freshly mixed so it stays perky and holds its shape really well. So I'm going to prepare the pan. These soft swirl meringues are about 1.5 inches across. So in order to ensure consistency of piping, you can do a couple of things. Typically, I will just draw guidelines, like these 2 straight lines. They're 1.5 inches apart, and I'll make sure I pipe within them. But if you really want much more structure to your piping, you can actually trace on the parchment paper using a cookie cutter or some other thing as your tracing guide. And I did a few of those, but typically all I need are 2 parallel lines to gauge the distance across and just space them at least 1 inch apart. Now, if you have drawn guides on your parchment paper, you do want to turn those drawings upside down, or the marker will actually bleed into the meringue as it bakes, and we wouldn't want that because I'm not using a food grade marker. You could use a food grade marker with food coloring, and then that wouldn't be a big deal. And then to keep that paper down, I pulled parchment off my roll of parchment paper so it's kind of curly and curvy. To keep it down, I've just tacked it down with a little bit of Crisco or butter at the corners of the pan. I've got all my ingredients ready to go for the soft swirl meringue, so let's get started. Just a reminder, go back to my hard meringue video for all the blow-by-blow details. I'm going to move pretty quickly here because I did cover it in great detail in that video. When making any meringue, be it hard meringue and any other type of meringue, it's important to have fat-free beaters, bowls, and whatnot, because if there's any small amount of fat, your egg whites will not whip up properly. So my 4 egg whites are going in. I like to work with them cool for meringues so that it whips up nice and firm and holds a stiff peak. I've kind of vacillated. Sometimes I say warm, sometimes I say cool, but I think I'm on the side of cool these days because I think I get a much tighter meringue that holds its shape better in the oven. I'm just going to whip that till it's frothy, gradually add my cup of superfine sugar. Again, remember I have about 4 tablespoons of sugar to every large egg white to create a hard meringue. Oops, but before I do that, I want to add my cream of tartar. This is a stabilizer, it's an acid and it acts to stabilize the meringue. I'm going to add that directly to the whites. Give it a little bit of a whirl, get them frothy, and then start gradually adding the sugar. So at this point, they're just frothy and a little bit bubbly. Just tip that to the camera so you can see. And this is about the stage where there's some body to them that I start adding the sugar. Once I've got it all in, it's not nearly whipped enough. See how it's flowing rather quickly off the whip attachment. I'm just stopping to scrape all the sugar into the bowl because some has gotten up on the sides. And then we'll whip for, oh, let's see, I think 5 to 10 minutes. I'm looking for somewhere between soft and stiff peaks. We're just a few minutes in. And just to show you the texture, it's definitely soft peaks. It's kind of flopping over in and on itself. I want it to be a little bit more rigid. I want a little softness to it because I want a nice little soft curl at the top of my meringues when I pipe them. But I think this is too loose to have a nice tight shape around the edge. So we're going to keep going with that for a bit. And the coloring and the cornstarch, which acts as an additional stabilizer, will go in at the very end. So I'm seeing the meringue begin to cling more tightly to the whip attachment, and it's much stiffer. It's still not stiff peaks, and I don't want super stiff peaks. I want it to lift up and kind of flop over like so, but not and leave a nice soft curl at the top. That's ideal because that'll look really cool when it's piped. So I think that's about as far as I will take it. I do want to add a little bit of coloring, and I want to sprinkle in that cornstarch. I'm just going to give the cornstarch a quick whirl through, and then we're going to add the coloring. I want this light pink. I'm working with my liquid gel food coloring. It's the same food coloring I use to tint my royal icing for cookies. It colors rather intensely. Every color, though, colors differently. The pink is super intense, so I can usually get away with a couple of drops, and it's a hot pink. Other colors, like red or purple, might need more food coloring, but typically I don't add more than 20 drops to the meringue, this amount of meringue, because if I add more than that, it materially changes the consistency of the meringue. It can make it more soupy and it can lose some of its texture. I'm going to put 2 drops in to start. Just give that a whirl till it's uniform. And you'll see it created a really soft pink color. I'm just going to add maybe 3 more drops, and then we're going to get that into the piping bag. I don't want to let it sit too long. My room here is pretty warm, and the meringue will deflate if it sits too long in a warm space, especially. It does better in a cooler environment. I'm adding 3 more drops. You can over whip it too. If you whip it too long, it heats it up and it loses some of its structure as well. I like to pipe this when it still has structure and shape, meaning immediately. If you were to wait, no good. So I'm just going to go around, and I'm going to pull up pretty quickly, and hopefully that'll, usually the quicker I pull up, the more likely I am to get a nice little curl at the tip. I don't always get it. There we go. I got a really floppy one there, but that looks kind of cool. Trying to make it look ice cream-like. And that one's absolutely perfect in terms of its curl. So I'd continue to fill out the tray. My oven's been preheated to 225 degrees Fahrenheit. These have a long baking time. It's actually more of a drying process, about an hour at 225. And then if they're still tacky to the touch, I'll turn it down to 200 degrees Fahrenheit and take it another hour. They want to be dry to the touch and just lift off, and they'll be dry all the way through. I do drop the temperature about an hour in, because if they stay and bake too long, at too long of a temperature, or too high of a temperature rather, too long, you can get some cracking in the meringue, and I'm trying to minimize the cracking. I want these to look as smooth as possible and as ice cream-like as possible. So the second component of our cone is obviously the cone itself, and this is a waffle cone. It's got this grid-like texture on it. I made that using my TUILE batter, which we mixed in TUILE 101. Just as a quick recap, here it is. I'm going to stir it. It's a batter. It's not really a dough. It runs really quickly off the spoon. This is basically 2 large egg whites at room temperature, to which I add a half a cup of superfine sugar again, beat it till it's frothy, add in a little bit of butter, melted, and a little bit of heavy cream, and then add another half a cup of flour, and you get something that's kind of this off-white color. This one actually has a little bit of food coloring in it already. And then the only other thing to know about it is that to create the shape, I usually spread it through a stencil. This is a stencil I cut out of acetate. It's a relatively heavy gauge acetate, and I'm going to be spreading the cookie batter no thicker than the thickness of this acetate. So you can see it's a really delicate and lovely cookie. But before I do that, I want this to look a little more waffle cone-like. So I am going to add a touch of food coloring to this to make it a little more yellow. I guess golden yellow color. So it looks like it's kind of browned the way waffle cones are. And to do that, I'm adding a drop of brown and a drop of golden yellow, and we're going to see what that does. And we'll adjust if I need to with more brown. That's really yellow. So I'm going to add more brown to this and tone that down. So that brown will kind of neutralize some of that yellow. I've got this a little more golden brown than I normally do, but we're going to work with that. This will be a really dark looking cone, maybe with a little less contrast to the stencil than the ones up front do, but let's just see what it does. And we're ready to spread it onto my cookie sheet. Before I do that, I do like to treat my silicone mats, even though it's baking on a silicone mat, which is supposedly non-stick, I do like to treat it with a little bit of non-stick spray. Usually the tuiles will come off a new silicone mat really easily, but an older mat, they can tend to stick to a little bit better. This is a brand new mat, but I'm going to still spray it. And there's a lot of spray pooled up here, so we want to just wipe that down. We don't want a lot of oil bubbling up underneath, or you'll get a really bubbly cookie when it bakes. I've had that happen sometimes where it's really, really bubbly. There will be some bubbling that occurs when it bakes in the oven, but it should subside as the baking process finishes. So I've laid my stencil on there, and I'm just going to spread a little batter over the top. So this is going to be a much richer colored, much more richly colored cone than the ones I have up top. It's probably a shade darker than I usually do. It'll be interesting to see how this turns out. It won't brown much in the oven, so the color will stay, it'll brown a little bit, but the color will stay pretty close to how you mix it, because it only bakes for a few minutes, 4 to 5 minutes in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And I just want to make sure I've got no thin spots. It's a little thin here, but otherwise I think it's pretty good. And I'll lift that stencil off. That's my basic shape. But now I want to get the grid pattern on it. And actually, I think it's easier to do that off the cookie sheet, and we'll put it on the cookie sheet right before it goes in the oven. So to get that grid pattern on it, I'm going to stencil a mixture of cocoa powder and powdered sugar on top, much the same way I stenciled the cylindrical dessert cup that I did in my TUILE 101 video. I've got a mixture of 3 parts powdered sugar to 1 part unsweetened cocoa powder, and that creates a really light looking mixture, like a light chocolate mixture. It will get darker as it bakes because the sugar will melt and some caramelization will occur, so the pattern will appear darker than the dry powder. And I'm just going to I've got this grid. I don't want to obviously lay it directly in the cookie batter or I'll mess it up. So I've got just little pieces of cardboard that I'm going to rest it across and just make sure it's straight. And then just lightly sift through a fine mesh sieve. You don't want one that has big holes. You're going to dump a lot of sugar, more than you need in any one area. So I'm just lightly tapping the side and getting even coverage over the top. And I think that's good. We'll lift this up, taking care not to knock any cocoa on top of the red grid onto the cookie underneath. And you can barely see the dry powder on top of the cookie. I'm hoping when that bakes, it'll be more visible. So now I can easily just slide the whole sheet or lift the whole silicone mat up onto the cookie sheet, taking care not to jostle the dry sugar and cocoa powder around, and that'll slide right into the oven. Okay, there it is out of the oven. You can see there's not as much distinction between the two colors, but you can still see the pattern and it looks kind of cool. We do want to shape it when it's hot. And to do that, I want to move it over to a clean side of my sheet and just wrap it around this cream horn mold that I've got, that we talked about earlier. I like to work with it still on the hot cookie sheet, but beware when you do that, not to burn yourself. And I try not to handle the front part of the cone too much because I don't want to smudge the cocoa. And the pattern doesn't look like much, but we're going to let it cool and we're going to brush off some of the extra powdered sugar, and I think you'll see more of that pattern reveal. So it's cool enough now that I can brush it off, and you'll see I've got some extra dry sugar here, and if I brush it off, the pattern really nicely reveals at the bottom. Now I just want to talk a little bit about how I get those doodads on top. I've done it on the pink one already. You might wonder why I didn't sprinkle them on top of the meringue before baking and let them bake into the meringue. The reason I don't do that is because the meringue bakes for an hour and a half, and some of these colors aren't particularly color fast in the sprinkles. They can actually bleed into the meringue, and I don't like how the bleeding looks. So I tend to prefer to actually apply the sprinkles after the fact, not during the baking process. But you might test your sprinkles. You might find you have a different experience with whatever brand of sprinkles you're using. The last time I did that, though, I had kind of a yucky looking mess. So I prefer to apply them with a touch of royal icing, at least the big ones with a touch of royal icing. And that's it, just kind of randomly. This just makes them look a little more ice cream-like and a little more festive. I'm going to put 3 or 4, maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 big ones of different colors in random spots on here. And if the meringue sits out in a humid environment for a couple of minutes, it'll get tacky enough that these will just stick to it without any royal icing. But generally, I like to work with these when they're completely dry. For the smaller jimmies, I will try my luck and just dropping them on top, and they'll sometimes just hang in the grooves quite nicely. But if I want more definitive placement of those, then again, I'll come back to royal icing to stick them in place. So now we're ready for the final assembly. And again, I wouldn't assemble these until just before eating because both cookies are very humidity sensitive, and even a soft filling on the inside of the cone could cause the cone to get soft pretty quickly. So just before service is when I do these, or just before setting my dessert table, for instance. So I've got my cone. I do like this one with a lighter background a little bit better. I'm filling it with a lemon mousse, which is a mixture of lemon curd and whipped cream, whipped very, very stiff so that I can pipe it. I don't want to fill it much more than right to the top. I just need a little something to stick my undecorated meringue in because I want this to look really like a full ice cream cone. I had a little crack on that side, so I'm putting the uncracked side forward. This is my front of the cone because the back obviously has a seam. And then I'm just going to sandwich the other one on top with just a dab of mousse because I don't want it squishing out the sides. And I like to line up, if I can, the swirls, so it looks like a continuous swirl from the bottom to the top. And I think that looks pretty darn ice cream-like and very, very luscious. So we've got lots of different filling options. I've used lemon mousse. You could do berries and whipped cream. You could do chocolate mousse. You could do little cake cubes topped with buttercream. Just a whole host of options and a couple of different presentation options at least. You've seen the mass display in front of you, an individual portion here. And in my book, Ultimate Cookies, I combine these ice cream cones with lollipop cookies and also little mini cake cookies to create a lavish dessert presentation, all composed of cookies. But the cookie cones alone are perfect treats for a summer party. So either scale it up or scale it down according to your taste. Till next video, live sweetly.